They thought it was just another routine patrol in the Montana wilderness. A wooden bridge, weathered by years of storms, gave way without warning, and a ranger's truck plunged into the icy river below. Radios failed, rescue crews were hours away. Salvation did not come with sirens or flashing lights. It came from a reclusive war veteran named Daniel Cain and the colossal black horse at his side. What followed was not only a rescue, but the spark that tore open a web of corruption, betrayal, and buried truths. Sometimes the most extraordinary heroes don't wear badges or uniforms. Sometimes they come scarred, with hooves that thunder, and a bond born in silence. The Lone Creek Valley lay cradled between Montana's granite shoulders, a place where time seemed to fold in on itself. It was not on the way to anywhere, and perhaps that was the point. Roads thinned to gravel, then vanished beneath snow for half the year. Winters here were merciless, summers brief and fragile. Beauty existed, but it was sharp-edged, the kind that warned you to tread carefully. Rivers cut through stone like blades. Forests whispered of centuries gone. And even in sunlight, you could sense the storm crouching just beyond the horizon. Cabins leaned tired against the earth, relics of families long gone when the mills closed and the fields soured. Most houses stood abandoned, their windows hollow, roofs sagging. Yet, in a few, stubborn lights still burned. Daniel Cain lived among them, a man who carried both visible scars and those unseen, a man who sought the silence the world had denied him. But the silence was about to break, and when it did, it would echo far beyond Lone Creek, dragging Daniel, his black stallion, and the rangers he saved into a fight where survival would no longer be the greatest test. For Daniel, that was precisely the appeal. Daniel Cain was 45 years old, and looked older on some mornings, younger on others, depending on how much the night had allowed him to sleep. Afghanistan had left its marks on him, some visible, some not. A ragged scar, cut across his left shoulder. The aftermath of shrapnel that still burned with phantom pain when the weather shifted. Nights often betrayed him with sudden jolts, awake sweat on his skin, his ears ringing with echoes of mortar fire that weren't there. He had learned to live with the ghosts, though they never truly left. Once he had been a soldier with a unit that trusted him, a man with a clear mission and comrades at his side. Now he was a veteran with paperwork debts and an honorable discharge that felt more like exile than recognition. The war had ended for him, but it had not released him. Daniel avoided the town below whenever possible. Social contact was something he rationed, like old rations in a pack, sparingly, only when necessary. People in Lone Creek knew him by sight, but not by name. They called him the vet up the valley, or that guy with the horse. He preferred it that way. New friends, new questions, new pitying looks. He had lived enough years to know that pity was harder to carry than pain. He carried himself with a discipline that had once been muscle memory bed, made boots lined at the door, every tool in its place. He moved like a soldier, even in the quiet of his riot. Cabin, steps, measured gestures efficient. Yet there was a heaviness to him, a weariness that clung to his shoulders when he thought no one was looking. Sometimes, when the silence pressed too hard, he remembered faces friends he'd lost overseas, men who had laughed with him, fought beside him, and never came home. Those memories could ambush him without warning. A joke shared in a convoy, a last smile before the blast, a name etched on a cross. He wondered often what it had all meant, whether any of it mattered now that he was here patching roofs and repairing fences to pay off medical bills he could barely afford. His life in Lone Creek was stripped down to the essentials. The cabin he lived in had once been built as a hunter's retreat. Now, it leaned a little to one side, its wood gone gray with weather. The roof leaked in the spring, and the floorboards groaned underfoot, but Daniel refused to abandon it. It was his in a way nothing else had been since he'd stepped off the plane from Kabul. He earned what little he could by working with wood-mending sheds, fixing porches, cutting beams for neighbors who still bothered with small farms. His hands, though scarred and stiff, still knew how to coax strength out of timber. He was not a craftsman by trade, but he was good enough to earn a few dollars at a time. They never covered everything. The medical bills from surgeries and therapy stacked higher than he could pay, and the old loan he had taken to survive after discharge lingered like a chain around his ankle. But he endured. Survival was something he knew how to do. Every morning followed the same rhythm. He rose before dawn, boiled water for the harsh black coffee he preferred, and stood on the cabin porch as the world shifted from shadow to light. Afterward, he cleaned the small shed that served as a stable, feeding the creature that had become his companion. Then he walked the ridges of the valley, boots sinking into the dew, the air sharp enough to remind him he was still alive. That companion was Raven. The horse was unlike any other. Daniel had seen a massive black stallion, whose coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the sun, whose eyes glowed amber in the dark. Raven carried the size and presence of something wild, a creature carved from the wilderness itself. Most horses looked at people with a kind of polite distance, but Raven's gaze was unnerving in its intelligence. It was as if the animal understood more than it should, as if it listened not only to words, but to silences. 3 years ago, Daniel had pulled Raven out of a slaughterhouse pen, a place where unwanted horses were sent to die. He hadn't planned on it. He'd only gone there to deliver scrap lumber, but something in the stallion's eyes had stopped him cold. Those eyes mirrored the same hollow grief he sometimes saw in the mirror after nightmares. Without thinking, Daniel had paid what little he had signed papers with a trembling hand and led the horse out, into the cold air. Since that day, they had been inseparable. Raven was no ordinary horse. He responded to unspoken cues, shifted when Daniel shifted, halted when Daniel's breath caught. Commands were hardly necessary. Often the stallion seemed to know what Daniel wanted before the thought was fully formed. At times it was unnerving, as though the bond between them was more than human and animal, as though war had left Daniel with a partner nature itself had sent to keep him upright. Daniel spoke to Raven, as if to an old friend. On nights when the valley seemed too silent, he would sit on the porch and murmur about memories that wouldn't let go. Raven would stand near ears, flicking a steady shadow in the dark. Sometimes, Daniel even caught himself smiling at the horse's stubborn responses, the way Raven would snort as if to dismiss his doubts. For a man who had lost his unit, his brothers, and the life he had known, Raven became something more than company. He became the comrade who never left. Every morning when Daniel nursed his coffee on the porch, Raven stood nearby, watchful. The stallion's stance carried a kind of soldierly vigilance, a sentinel posted beside the cabin. To outsiders, it might have looked like a horse grazing aimlessly, but Daniel knew better. Raven was guarding, always. The atmosphere of Daniel's life was heavy, colored by memories and regrets that clung like smoke. There was little joy, little reason to believe in anything beyond the next sunrise. He often wondered if his life had ended in Afghanistan, and all of this was some kind of afterlife, an endless cycle of surviving, without purpose. The people in town rarely spoke to him. The government had forgotten him. His debts mocked him, and most days he believed the world would go on unchanged if he simply vanished into the trees. Yet in the midst of that darkness, Raven remained a stubborn reminder that life still had weight. The stallion was not merely an animal to feed and water. He was proof that Daniel still had something worth protecting. Raven's loyalty, his sharp instincts, his quiet strength, and these things kept Daniel tethered when the world threatened to pull him under. The horse was more than flesh and bone. He was a symbol of survival, of resilience, of a bond that endured even when everything else was broken. The morning broke quietly over Lone Creek, the kind of quiet that seemed older than the valley itself. Early spring had not yet decided if it wanted to stay. Snow still clung in patches beneath the trees, and the earth was damp with thaw. Mist curled low across the weaving between pines and aspens until the whole valley looked like it had been swallowed by a pale, shifting sea. The air was heavy with moisture, cool against the skin, and the silence of the place was broken only by the distant murmur of water moving under the last of the ice. Daniel Cain rose as he always did before the light had fully claimed the ridges. He brewed his coffee, black and strong, the bitter taste an anchor against the restless edge of his nerves. Sitting on the porch of his cabin, he wrapped both hands around the chipped mug, watching steam mingle with the fog. Beside the steps, the colossal stallion stood a dark silhouette against the pearl-gray dawn. Raven's presence was as much a part of this ritual as the coffee. He never wandered far in these early hours, preferring to linger near the cabin like a sentinel, waiting for orders. The world felt unchanged, suspended in a kind of stillness that could fool a man into believing nothing in it would ever shift. Daniel had come to depend on mornings like this, the repetition of them, the sameness. It was a fragile peace, a loop he allowed himself to believe in, even as he knew peace could be shattered by the smallest of cracks. And on this morning, that crack appeared subtle at first, but undeniable. Raven was not himself. The stallion usually carried an aura of calm, a patience born of both size and experience. He was steady, even in storm winds, unbothered by coyotes yipping in the distance or branches breaking in the forest. That morning, though, his muscles were taut beneath the black sheen of his coat. His hooves struck the earth with restless rhythm, each stomp echoing in the damp air. His ears were pinned forward, unmoving, locked on something unseen. He drew in sharp breaths, nostrils flaring as if he were catching scents carried from far off. His man flicked as he tossed his head, amber eyes focused on a direction beyond the cabin, beyond the fog, as though some invisible signal called to him. Daniel followed the line of Raven's gaze, and saw nothing but mist and trees. But the stallion would not relent. "Easy, boy," Daniel muttered, setting his mug aside. He stepped down from the porch boots, sinking into damp soil. His hand brushed Raven's neck, feeling the quiver of tension there. The horse shifted, snorting, then looked directly at him before swinging its head again toward the east. Bear Creek lay that way several miles out. The old wooden bridge crossed a narrow stretch of river that locals still used despite its age. Daniel had walked it many times on patrols. There was nothing remarkable about it, nothing that should cause a horse to pause and react this way. And yet, Raven stared at it as if the bridge itself were calling at him, demanding his attention. The stallion stamped harder, tail lashing, then turned his head back to Daniel again. His eyes burned with urgency, a message too plain to ignore. "We need to go there." Daniel's first instinct was to dismiss it. Animals spooked at shadows, at smells, too faint for human senses. But Raven wasn't a nervous creature. He wasn't a cult reacting to thunder. He had carried Daniel through storms without a flinch, had stood calm while deer burst from the brush under his nose. This was different. This wasn't fear, it was focus. A memory stirred. Dusty, unwelcome, but sharp. Afghanistan. Heat shimmering off broken ground. The heavy panting of a Belgian Malinois, straining at the end of its leash. Daniel Sargent had muttered under his breath, "Never ignore the dog. If it tells you something's wrong, believe it. The animal knows before you do." And the sergeant had been right. That dog had smelled IEDs hidden beneath roadbeds and alerted to ambushes before the first shots were fired. Men had lived because they trusted instincts, not their own. Daniel blinked, the memory overlaid on. The fog of Montana. Raven stood before him now, not a dog trained for detection, but a horse with eyes too sharp to ignore. The stallion pawed the ground, ears, unyielding gaze unbroken. The soldier in Daniel stirred the part of him that had never really gone quiet. His body remembered before his mind agreed, the pulse of adrenaline, the readiness to move, the certainty that instincts, human or animal, were warnings carved from survival itself. The voice of his sergeant echoed again. "Don't ever overlook the signal from the beast that walks with you. They see what you can't." Daniel exhaled long and slow, feeling the weight of choice pressing against him. He could stay. He could chalk this up to restlessness, let the morning, and continue its march toward normally. There was coffee cooling on the porch, chores waiting. If he ignored Raven, the day would fold into the same dull routine as yesterday, and the day before that, and the 1,000 before those. But the look in Raven's eyes cut deeper than routine. It was insistent, almost pleading, carrying the same intensity Daniel remembered in the eyes of his men when they had relied on him to make a call in. The field. Trust me. Move now. For years, he had lived as though his choices no longer mattered, as if the war had drained every last purpose from him. And yet, here stood this animal, refusing to let him dismiss the possibility that something out there required his presence. "Damn you," Daniel muttered under his breath, though there was no anger in it. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture as weary as it was resigned. "All right." He stepped back into the cabin, pulled on the old field jacket he rarely wore, except in the harshest weather. The cloth smelled faintly of dust and memory, the weight of it grounding him. From the wall, he took down a long knife and Afghan blade, gifted by a fellow soldier, and slid it into its sheath. His revolver, battered but reliable, was checked and loaded. Old habits. You didn't walk blind into the unknown. When he returned to the porch, Raven was waiting head high. Nostrils flared, as though he had known Daniel's answer already. Daniel took up the reins, though they were hardly necessary. "All right, soldier," he said quietly, voice carrying the tone of a man giving into command rather than issuing one. "If you're that sure, we'll go take a look." Raven shook his head once maimed, scattering droplets of dew, then turned sharply toward the trail that wound down through the valley. His hooves struck the earth with authority, leading the way without hesitation. Daniel followed the fog, swallowing both man and horse as they set out toward Bear Creek. The path narrowed quickly the forest, drawing close on either side. Pines rose like centuries, their trunks slick with moisture. Birds startled from branches at Raven's approach, fluttering into the mist with shrill cries. The air grew colder as they descended, the kind of cold that sank into joints, and whispered of rivers near at hand. Daniel's mind worked in the silence, piecing together what little he knew. Raven had never reacted like this before, not in 3 years. He trusted the stallion, as he had trusted his brothers in arms, and that trust had rarely failed him. If Raven wanted him to see something, then something was out there. Each step of the horse seemed to echo the rhythm of Daniel's own thoughts, steady, relentless, carrying him closer to whatever lay ahead. His instincts sharpened senses reaching beyond the fog. Every snap of twig, every shift of air was catalogued, measured. He was no longer just a man in exile, trudging through a valley. He was a soldier again, moving toward a mission he had not chosen, but could not refuse. The fog thinned as the sound of rushing. Water grew stronger. The river cut through the valley floor ahead, unseen but undeniable. Somewhere above it, the old Bear Creek Bridge spanned the current, a relic of weathered planks and hand-hewn beams. Daniel had crossed it dozens of times, always with the quiet calculation of whether it would hold another season. But Raven's urgency suggested something more than rot and age. The stallion quickened muscles bunching beneath dark hide as he led Daniel down the final slope. Daniel adjusted his grip on the reins, his pulse steady but alert. He didn't know what they would find, only that the air carried the charged stillness of a moment about to break. The morning mist still clung to the valley floor as Clara Hayes guided the Forest Service truck up the narrow road towards Bear Creek. She was 32 strong in frame and presence, with the kind of steady confidence that came from years of knowing the woods better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. Her hair, chestnut brown and streaked with lighter strands from long days in the sun, was tied back in a neat braid that brushed the collar of her ranger jacket. The cab of the truck smelled faintly of wet pine and coffee in a travel mug she had forgotten to finish. On the passenger seat lay a folded map of the district, its creases worn thin from years of use. On top of it rested a small leather-bound notebook, open to a page of scribbles she had made the day before. Coordinates, dates, odd marks of chainsaw cuts she had noticed in areas where logging was strictly forbidden. Clara had been chasing rumors of illegal timber harvests for weeks now. The paperwork on her desk at headquarters told one story. Her instincts told another. Somewhere, someone was cutting corners, maybe cutting more than that. But the task today was simpler. Overnight rain had lashed the mountains, and she was assigned to inspect known weak spots along the access roads. Bear Creek Bridge was on her list, a crossing that had worried her more than once. Built decades earlier from rough-hewn beams, it had been patched and reinforced more times than she could count. Each year she filed reports about its condition, and each year the funding to condition. In place it was delayed. She made a note to press the issue harder in her next review. As the truck bounced over ruts in the dirt road, Clara chewed absently on the end of a pencil, thinking about how she would word the recommendation. She would stress liability, emphasize public safety. She could already imagine the groans from her supervisor, who preferred reports to be tidy and non-confrontational. But she was right, and she knew it. The bridge wasn't safe. She slowed as the road leveled and the trees parted, revealing the structure ahead. Mist pulled thickly above the river, and the bridge stretched across like a ghost, its railings damp with rain, its planks slick. Clara pressed her lips together, shifted the truck into low gear, and eased forward. The tires thumped onto the wooden surface. For a moment, everything seemed ordinary. The boards creaked, the suspension groaned, but it was the same chorus she had heard 100 times before. She glanced at the notepad, reminding herself to mark the exact location of the deepest sagging beams. Then came the sound. It was sharp, violent, a splintering crack that shivered up through the steering wheel and into her bones. Another followed, rapid, overlapping, as if the very ribs of the bridge were snapping in sequence. Clara's eyes widened. "No," she whispered. The floor beneath her dropped. The bridge gave way. In a single catastrophic lurch, the truck pitched downward the horizon, tilting sickeningly. Her pencil flew from her hand as the map slid off the seat. She gripped the wheel with both hands as if it might anchor her, but the world was already falling. Wood shattered. The truck slammed nose first into the current below with a force that stole her breath. Glass spiderwebbed across the windshield fragments, bursting inward. Water surged and cold and merciless, filling the cab in an instant. Panic hit like a hammer. Clara gasped, lungs dragging in both air and spray. She fumbled for the door handle, shoving against it, but it refused to move. The outside pressure pinned it shut, a wall of river pressing from every direction. She clawed at the seatbelt buckle, but the strap had twisted during impact, cinched tight across her chest like a vice. Her fingers slipped. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it over the roar of the water. The river did not care. It climbed higher, icy and fast, rising to her ribs, then her shoulders. Papers swirled in the cab, bobbing like dying fish. Her notebook brushed against her cheek before vanishing under the rising flood. Clara gasped again, but her breath was shallow now, frantic. She braced against the dashboard, tried to shove herself upward for one more, a lungful of air, but the ceiling was already low with water. She felt the terrifying burn of oxygen thinning the dizzying fog creeping in from the edges of her vision. For the first time in years, fear gripped her with absolute certainty she was going to die here, in this truck, on a bridge she had warned them about. On the bank above, Daniel Cain had just broken through the fog with Raven at his side. The valley echoed with a splintering crash, a sound too violent to be anything natural. His eyes locked on the bridge just in time to see the truck vanish into the white churn below. "God damn it," he breathed, legs already moving. Raven's scream split the morning air, a piercing, furious neigh that carried like a battle cry. Before Daniel could reach the river's edge, the horse was already in motion. The stallion tore down the slope, black muscles coiled with power. Mud and stones flew beneath his hooves. At the water's edge, he didn't hesitate. He launched forward, plunging into the torrent with a surge that sent spray fanning into the mist. The river tried to shove him back, but Raven cut through it, his massive frame driving into the current like a living engine. Daniel followed, his boots pounding the bank until he dove headlong into the freezing water. The cold hit like a sledgehammer, shocking every nerve, but he forced his arms to move, cutting through the current. Through spray and debris, he saw Raven battling the river, fighting toward the half-submerged truck. The stallion slammed his chest against the hood, using his weight to pin the vehicle against the current. Metal groaned, but for a moment, the truck stopped the drifting. Daniel understood instantly Raven was buying him time. The sight was surreal, impossible. A horse colossal in black, holding the nose of a drowning vehicle steady, while its rider swam into danger. Daniel reached the side of the truck, fingers numb, knife already in his hand. He tried the door first out of instinct, but it didn't budge. The water pinned it shut as surely as steel. Inside, he glimpsed movement. A woman thrashing her hair, fanning out like dark kelp, her face pale and terrified. He slammed the butt of his knife against the side window, once, twice, 3 times. The glass fractured, then burst. Outward. The river seized its chance, roaring into the cab. The woman was yanked toward him in a rush of bubbles and paper. Daniel grabbed her arm muscles, straining, as the river tried to claim them both. She clawed at him in panic, her nails raking his sleeve, her lungs desperate for air. Her movements weakened in seconds, her body going slack as consciousness slipped. "Hold on," he barked through the water, swallowed his voice. He wrapped his arm around her chest, kicked away from the sinking truck, and angled toward the black shape wading in. The current. Raven's eyes were wide and blazing, his body trembling with effort as he anchored against the pole. "Steady, Raven," Daniel shouted when his head broke the surface. "Hold steady." The stallion obeyed, muscles, locking his bulk, braced against the surge. Daniel fought the current until he reached him, shoving the woman upward. Raven shifted, lowering his flank, and Daniel heaved until she slid across the wet saddle of his back. Her body sprawled limply, head lolling, but she was above water now. "Go," Daniel gasped, gripping the reins, with one hand as his other clung to Raven's mane. The horse lunged forward, each kick of his legs, a battle against the flood. Daniel kicked 2, half swimming, half dragged, keeping the woman balanced. Together, man and horse carved a desperate line toward shore. Every inch was a war. The river wanted to tear them away, to grind them against boulders downstream. Daniel's lungs burned, his arms screamed with exhaustion, but Raven drove on relentless until at last his hooves struck gravel and he surged out of the water. They collapsed together on the muddy bank, Daniel on his knees, the woman coughing violently as she expelled water from her lungs. Raven standing over them, drenched and heaving his great chest. rising and falling like a war drum. Clara rolled onto her side, retching, water spilling from her lips. Her chest spasmed as her body fought for breath. Daniel knelt beside her, pressing a hand against her back, murmuring steady words she barely heard. She coughed again, a ragged sound that eventually broke into wheezing inhalations. Her eyes fluttered open, dazed but alive. "You're all right," Daniel said, hoarsely. "You're all right now." Raven stood over them, water streaming from his coat ears, pinned eyes fixed back on the broken bridge. He looked less like a horse than a soldier on guard scanning for threats. Daniel followed his gaze chest, still, heaving, and felt his stomach twist. The bridge sagged in ruin, its planks, twisted and scattered, but the break was too clean. The beams didn't look rotted through. They hadn't split with age. The edges were sharp, almost surgical. Daniel pushed himself to his feet, staggering toward the wreckage. He crouched, fingers brushing the splintered ends. Not splinters cuts, straight, precise cuts. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. Behind him, Clara coughed again, propping herself on her elbows. Her. The voice was barely audible. What did you say?" Daniel turned to her, eyes hard. "That wasn't an accident," he said. "Somebody cut those beams." The words hung in the mist like gunfire, impossible to take back. Clara's breathing finally steadied after 10 long minutes. Her soaked ranger jacket clung to her like a second skin, and her hands still trembled from the cold and the memory of drowning. Daniel had kindled a small fire on the bank, using half-dry kindling and the remnants of an emergency kit he always carried. Raven stood nearby, steam rising from his black coat as the warmth of the flames licked at the damp air. Clara pressed, her palms close to the fire, staring into the flames as though words might come from them. Daniel crouched a short distance away, his sharp eyes reading the lines of her face. He didn't speak. He knew silence sometimes loosened tongues better than questions. Finally, Clara drew in a shaky breath. "That wasn't just a collapsed bridge," she said, her voice still. "I think you know that." Daniel nodded once. He had seen the cuts. Clara swallowed hard and went on. "I've been investigating illegal logging in the park for months. It started small, fresh chainsaw marks where there shouldn't be any tire tracks near closed trails. Then I started seeing trucks moving at night, loaded with timber they didn't have permits for. When I dug into the paperwork, I found duplicate permits, forged signatures, approvals that made no sense." Her words came faster now, as if the dam had broken. "I filed reports, detailed ones, sent them to my supervisor, and then nothing. No follow-up, not even an acknowledgement, just silence, like my reports disappeared into a void." She shivered. Again, but Daniel couldn't tell if it was from cold or from memory. "3 weeks ago, I got a letter." She pulled a crumpled scrap of paper from her pocket, and the ink blurred but still legible. 4 words. "Stop digging if you want to live." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I thought maybe it was just intimidation," Clara said. "But the last few days, I felt eyes on me. Last night, driving back from the station, I swear a truck followed me half the way. This morning, I was planning to document the bridge egg's condition again, and then," she gestured helplessly at the wreckage downriver. "Now, I'm sure that collapse wasn't an accident. It was meant for me." Her voice cracked on the last word. For a heartbeat, she looked less like the strong, steady ranger, and more like a young woman forced to admit death had brushed against her. Daniel reached for a piece of driftwood, tossed it into the fire, and stared at the sparks. "They wanted to make sure you didn't file any more reports," he said. His mind pulled him back thousands of miles to a place of dust and fire. Bridges in Afghanistan had fallen under his watch, too. Not from age, but from hands that wanted them gone. He remembered the pop of explosives on a supply route, the plume of smoke where a convoy should have passed safely. He remembered locals whispering that bridges were never safe, that enemies always watched the choke points. What he had seen on the beams of Bear Creek matched those memories exactly. Straight, deliberate cuts, wood weakened in the right places, so the weight of a truck would do the rest. "They sabotaged it," Daniel said, his voice low, but certain. "I've seen it before. Different tools, different soil, but the same intent. Take out the bridge trap, whoever's crossing. Sometimes it was to cut supply lines. Sometimes it was to make a statement." Clara looked at him, her eyes wide. "This wasn't sloppy," he continued. "Whoever did it knew exactly where to cut, how much to leave, so it would hold until just the wrong moment. That's not just some lumber thief trying to scare you. That's training. Her brow furrowed. Training. Military. Paramilitary. Someone who studied sabotage. I can smell it. Clara blinked at the certainty in his voice, then whispered, "You think this is bigger than logging?" "I think," Daniel said slowly, "that whoever's running this has experience and I know a name." He spat the word like it tasted bad. Cole Maddox. Clara's breath caught. The man who runs. Lone Creek Timber. Daniel nodded grimly. Former officer. I've heard people in town talk. The way he runs his company, the people he hires, ruthless, efficient, and his crew's too disciplined for just loggers. I bet my last dollar he's behind this. The fire snapped loudly as though to punctuate his words. Clara stared into the flames, chewing the inside of her cheek. "Finally," she said, "there's someone you need to meet. He's been watching this. Longer than I have. His name's Elias Ward. Uzi used to be a hunter, well, known around here before everything fell apart for him. He lives near the old quarry he keeps to himself. But I know he's been gathering evidence on Lone Creek Timber. He lost someone." Her voice softened. "His granddaughter." Daniel looked toward Raven, who flicked an ear as if listening, then back at Clara. Her face was earnest, her eyes carrying both exhaustion and resolve. "All right," he said. "Let's go hear what he has." Raven carried them both through the forest, his hooves thewing steadily against soft earth. Clara sat behind Daniel, her arms hesitant at first, then tightening around his waist as Raven climbed a ground slope slick with moss. The air smelled of wet soil and pine, needles of a wilderness that seemed untouched but wasn't. They reached the edge of the abandoned quarry near dusk. The land there was scarred, stripped, bare in patches where machines had once bitten into the earth. A small cabin crouched at the tree end, smoke trickling from its chimney. Elias Ward stepped out before they reached the porch as if he had been listening for them. He was 62, but grief had aged him beyond the number. His frame was lean, almost gaunt, his hair gray and wild. His eyes, though, were what struck Daniel most hollow, but sharp like glass, cracked, but unbroken. He carried a rifle slung loosely over one shoulder, more habit than threat. "What brings a ranger and a stranger to my doorstep?" Elias asked, his voice rough. Clara slid off Raven's back and approached carefully. "We need to talk about Lone Creek Timber." For a long moment, Elias said nothing. Then he gestured them inside. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and old leather. Shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and ammunition stood against the walls. A single photograph rested on the mantel. A young girl with bright eyes and a gap to smile holding up a fishing pole almost as tall as she was. "Laya," Elias said when he saw Daniel looking. His voice thinned. "She was 10. I love the woods more than anyone I've known." Clara touched his arm gently. "Daniel needs to hear what happened." Elias sank into a chair, his hands knotting together. 2 years ago, she was playing near the old mine shaft while I was setting traps nearby. The ground gave way. At least that's what they told me afterward. Said the soil was unstable, an accident. But I knew better. That land had been torn hollow by illegal logging, the runoff, undermining, the shafts. They'd weakened it for profit. My Laya paid the price. His voice broke. He covered his face with one hand. After that, my wife left. Couldn't bear to look at me. Couldn't bear the place. I stayed hunting, tracking, watching, because I knew someone had to pay. Daniel felt the weight of the man's grief settle in the room like an extra presence. It was the same weight he had carried for lost brothers overseas. The weight that never left, but hardened into obsession. "You started collecting proof," Daniel said quietly. Elias looked up's eyes glinting. "Damn right I did." From a corner he dragged out 2 wooden crates, their lids worn smooth from years of handling. He set them on the table and opened them. Inside lay stacks of photographs, notes, tapes, evidence. "Here," Elias said, pulling one photo free. It showed a truck loaded with fresh-cut logs moving down a mountain road at night. The license plate was deliberately smeared with mud, but the outline of the company logo on the door was faintly visible. "They think driving at night makes them invisible. Not to me." He spread a map, next red circles marking weak bridges, ravaged clearings, trails rerouted around hidden cuts. Every place they strip I mark. Every place a collapse is waiting. From the crate, he pulled an old recorder. He pressed play. Static hissed. Then the voices rough. cautious but distinct. "Maddox wants it moved. Keep the loads clean, no mistakes." Clara stiffened. "That's Cole Maddox's name." Elias's jaws set. "I've sent copies. Heard of this to the sheriff, to the state police. All I got back was silence. Nothing. They buried it." Daniel sifted through the papers, the photographs, the map marked in desperate red. It was meticulous, the work of a man who had lost everything but purpose. Elias leaned close, his voice hard as flint. "You want to fight this? You'd better be. Ready to bleed for it. They killed my granddaughter, and they'll kill anyone who threatens their money. Don't think for a second they'll stop with you." Raven snorted from outside, stamping. Once, as if to underscore the warning. Daniel met Elias's eyes, steady and unflinching. "Then we don't stop either." The ride back into town was quieter than Daniel liked. Clara sat pressed against Raven's withers, her arms firm around Daniel's waist, though her mind seemed miles away. Behind them, Elias rode in, the bed of a borrowed flatbed truck, the crates of evidence strapped down with rope. His gaunt face was set, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if daring it to shift into another nightmare. Lone Creek looked unchanged as they descended the last ridge. Storefronts still bore faded signs. The diners still exhaled the scent of coffee and fried potatoes into the street, and old-timers lingered on benches outside the hardware store. But to Daniel's eye, the details didn't fit the picture. A pair of logging trucks idled where they hadn't the day before. Men he didn't recognize leaned against them, arms, folded their gazes, just a little too intent as Raven lopped past. Clara noticed too. Her hand tightened, unconsciously. "They know," she whispered. Daniel didn't answer. He kept his eyes moving, cataloging shadows, exit points, alleys. His pulse settled into the old soldier's rhythm, the calm that came before the hit. Raven's ears flicked back and forth, his nostrils wide head, tossing. He could feel it as well, the shift in air, the press of danger. The district ranger's office sat near the edge of town, a clapboard building that had once been a schoolhouse, its green paint peeled at the edges, but the flag on the pole fluttered in clean lines as though trying to insist on dignity. Clara swung off Raven and straightened her damp jacket, every line of her body rehearsed into professionalism despite the bruises shadowing her jaw. Inside, the reception smelled of paper and pine cleaner. Behind the front desk, instead of the familiar secretary, a man waited, tall, broad, shouldered with silver, just beginning to thread his close-cropped hair. His shirt sleeves were rolled, revealing forearms marked by old scars. On the wall behind him hung a framed uniform jacket, pressed and preserved, with metals gleaming faintly in the low light. "Cole Maddox." Clara breathed. He stepped forward, hand extended in a show of courtesy. His voice was warm, but the warmth felt too deliberate, like an actor repeating a practiced line. "Miss Hayes. Miss, I heard about the accident. Thank God you made it out alive." Daniel didn't move to shake. He watched the man's eyes. Cold, precise, already. Calculating. "The bridge," Clara said carefully. "It wasn't an accident." Cole's smile was sympathetic, almost paternal. Those old beams, they were bound to give. "Eventually. I've told the district for years it needed replacement. You were lucky it lasted this long." The words were smooth, but too smooth. Daniel's gut told him this wasn't a man surprised by disaster. It was a man rehearsing a defense he had prepared long before the fall. Cole invited them into the meeting room, a wide space with a long table and dusty blinds half drawn against the light. On the table lay a stack of papers bound in a folder. He tapped it with one finger. "My inspectors were already scheduled to review the bridge. Here's the preliminary report. Rotten wood, poor maintenance, no indication of tampering." Clara leaned forward, bracing her hands against the table. "That's a lie. I saw the cuts, straight, clean chainsaw work." Cole chuckled softly, the sound grating in its condescension. "Miss Hayes' trauma plays tricks on the mind. In panic, memory distorts. I don't doubt you believe you saw something, but the evidence says otherwise." Daniel studied him. The man's body language was too loose, too comfortable, for someone blindsided by accusation. His every move screamed control. Elias slammed his fist onto the table, making the folder jump. "I watched you people bury the truth, before my granddaughter died because of you." His voice cracked with fury, and, for a heartbeat, his grief filled the room like thunder. Cole didn't flinch. He glanced at Elias the way one might look at a stray dog. "Mr. Ward, I sympathize with your loss, but dragging wild accusations into my office won't. Bring her back." Clara's face flushed. She gathered the file of photographs from Elias's crate, slamming them down in front of Cole. Then explain these trucks hauling timber at night, maps of clearing stripped bare, recordings with your name. Cole's smile thinned. He didn't reach for the photos. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. And in that subtle gesture, Daniel saw it. The signal. The door creaked behind them. Two men stepped in, shoulders square, eyes flat. Another blocked the window. Their boots were clean, their movements too precise. Not local loggers, not town drifters. These were trained. Clara inhaled sharply. What are you? Cole's tone shifted, pleasantness evaporating into steel. You should have let the accident be an accident, Miss Hayes. But some people don't know when to stop. Elias's hand twitched toward the hunting knife at his belt, but Daniel stopped him with a look. He could read the formation. The trapped 3 men choke points covered no clean exit. They were boxed inside a government building, about to disappear into its walls. Daniel felt the old instinct rise, the one drilled into his bones through years of combat. His breath slowed, his vision narrowed, details sharpening the angle of one man's stance, the weight shift before a strike. They hadn't come to scare, they'd come to erase. Cole folded his arms. This doesn't have to be messy. Hand me the evidence and maybe I let you walk out. Maybe. The word maybe hung heavy. Clara's jaws set. She moved as if to step back toward the door, but the men shifted, closing the gap. Elias muttered, voice low and trembling with rage. This is just like Laya. File it away. Pretend it never happened. Daniel's grip tightened around the hilt of his knife beneath the table. If the fight came, he'd take the closest one, first disarm, use the gun to cover. Clara. He didn't let his eyes flick toward her, but his whole body coiled with readiness. The air in the room was taut, ready to break. The break came in wood and thunder. The front doors exploded inward, slamming against the walls with splinters flying. A black mass surged through larger than any man. Raven. The stallion barreled into the room with a scream that rattled the blinds. His hooves struck the floor like hammers, his chest driving straight into the nearest thug. The man went airborne, crashing into a filing cabinet that toppled with a crash of metal. Chaos erupted. Another man lunged forward only, to be met by Raven's rear hooves kicking back. The crack of impact sent him, sprawling, gasping for breath. Clara staggered back, eyes wide with shock. The sight was unreal. A horse, massive and wild, dominating the center of a ranger office like a war beast out of legend. His man was flung wild, his teeth bared, his eyes burning with a fury that was more than animal. The third thug froze, staring at the nightmare in front of him. He bolted for the back door, the sound of his boots fading into the street. Daniel was already moving. He lunged at the man nearest him, wrenched the pistol from his grip, and drove him into the wall. The weapon came free easily. He pivoted, covering the room with trained precision. The muzzle leveled steady as his heartbeat. Don't, he warned Cole. Cole hadn't moved from his place near the head of the table. His expression remained unnervingly calm, though his men groaned on the floor around him. Raven snorted, pawing the ground, placing himself between Daniel's group and their enemies. His massive body blocked the path, his stance protective, as though he understood the stakes with perfect clarity. Clara's breath caught. My God, she whispered. He knew. Daniel didn't take his eyes off Cole. He always knows. They backed out together, Raven keeping pace, Daniel's stolen pistol never wavering. Elias half-dragged one of the crates with him, unwilling to leave the evidence behind. Clara clutched the other against her chest like a shield. Outside, townsfolk had gathered, drawn by the crash. Their murmurs rippled through the street as the sight registered Clara Hayes, the ranger, Elias Ward the hermit, Daniel Cain the stranger, and the massive black stallion stepping out of the office like a beast from battle. Behind them, Cole Maddox emerged into the doorway. His shirt was rumpled from the chaos, but his face showed no fear, no anger, only calculation. His eyes met Daniel's, across the distance, unblinking, as though measuring him the way commanders once measured enemy officers across a battlefield. Daniel felt the recognition settle deep in his gut. He'd seen that look before in Afghanistan in men who built traps and covered tracks, who understood how to twist chaos into their advantage. They weren't dealing with a greedy businessman, they were dealing with a soldier. Daniel holstered the pistol jaw set. He knows how to make it look clean, he told Clara and Elias as they reached the far side of the street. How to twist evidence until victims look like fools. He's done it before, and he'll do it again. Clara's face was pale, but her eyes blazed. Then we prove it before he erases us. Elias clutched his crate tighter, his voice raw. If it costs us everything? Raven shook his head, mane flying a low rumble building in his chest like thunder. Daniel looked once more at Cole Maddox, standing framed in the ranger office doorway. And he understood this wasn't just about trees or stolen timber or even sabotage. This was war. The forest had swallowed them whole by the time Lone Creek's lights fell behind. Daniel steered the group off the main track, cutting through shadowed trails where only hunters and deer usually passed. Raven carried Clara effortlessly, despite the strain of the day, his black coat shimmering faintly beneath the cotted starlight. Elias followed on foot, leading the way along deer paths only a lifetime of tracking could reveal. By nightfall, they stopped near a narrow creek, the water murmuring over stones, slick with moss. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Daniel built a small fire, the flames hidden by a ring of rocks. Clara crouched beside the water, rinsing, blood and dirt from her hands. Elias sat on a fallen log, his rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the trees. Raven stood a little apart, head high, ears flicking, his silhouette massive against the silver glow of moonlight. For a while, the night seemed calm. The fire crackled softly, the creek whispered, and the wind sighed through the branches. Daniel almost let himself believe they had escaped the storm. Almost. Raven's ears snapped forward, his head jerked up, nostrils flaring. A deep rumble shook his chest. "Something's wrong," Daniel murmured, already reaching for his knife. The gunfire cracked from the darkness. Bullets tore through the trees, splintering bark, sending sparks from the fire. Clara dropped flat. Elias rolled behind the log, and Daniel spun, instincts roaring alive. Raven screamed a sound that split the night. He surged forward, massive body, interposing between the shooters and the humans he had claimed as his herd. The shot that followed struck his shoulder with a sickening thud. His body lurched sideways, legs staggering. Still, he advanced, eyes blazing, as though daring the unseen attackers to face him. Raven Daniel's voice ripped through the chaos. The stallion swayed, but his scream carried through the trees like thunder. The ferocity of it sent shadows, moving men retreating, fading back into the forest. Daniel dropped to one knee, pistol, steady firing, controlled bursts into the dark. The return fire faltered, then stopped. Silence swallowed the clearing, except for the ringing in their ears. Then Raven collapsed. The ground shook with the weight of him. His black coat glistened with blood that pulsed from his shoulder, staining the grass in thick, hot rivulets. He tried to rise legs, scrambling, but his strength gave way. His great head lowered until his muzzle touched the earth, breath rasping. "No, no, no." Clara crawled to his side, her hands slick with his blood before she even realized she was touching him. "Stay with us, boy. Please." Daniel knelt hard beside the stallion, pressing his hand to the wound. Warmth spilled through his fingers too fast, too much. "God damn it," he growled, pressing harder, his combat training flashing through him in useless fragments. "Clara, get cloth, anything." Elias staggered closer, eyes wide, grief and rage colliding across his face. For a heartbeat, he seemed frozen, as though watching Lia's death replayed before him. Then he dropped to his knees and tore strips from his own shirt, handing them over. Daniel bound them tight, but Raven's breath came rougher, rattling deep in his chest. His great amber eyes flicked between them, glassy but determined, as if to say he would not leave. "Not yet. We have to move," Daniel said. "Now there's one person who can help him." Who? Clara's voice shook. "Dr. Hannah Lowe. She's the only vet who will know what to do." They reached Hannah's place an hour later. Every step of Raven's staggering gait etched into Daniel's memory. Blood trailed them like a scar through the forest. Daniel led, pulling on the res, coaxing, pleading, while Clara pressed against Raven's side, whispering encouragements through her tears. Elias trudged silently behind, face carved from stone. Hannah's property stood at the far edge of the valley, a sanctuary of wood and wire pens filled with a faint sense of hay and disinfectant. Lights glowed in the windows of her first barn, and the barking of dogs announced their desperate arrival. The woman herself emerged from the barn, wiping her hands on a towel. She froze when she saw the black giant staggering toward her, crimson, soaking his side. "Dear God," she whispered. "What in heaven's name happened?" "No time," Daniel barked. "He's bleeding out. We need you." Hannah's eyes widened, but only for a moment. Then her training took over. "Get him inside now. Stall 3. She spun on her heel, barking orders to assistants, who seemed to materialize from the barn's shadows. Together, they half led, half carried Raven into the wide straw-lined stall. He collapsed with a shudder, the timbers creaking under his weight. Hannah knelt immediately at his side, her hands moving with swift, sure motions. "Never seen anything like this," she muttered, eyes tracing the wound. "He should be down for good, but he's still fighting." "What kind of horse is this?" Daniel crouched beside her, voice low. "The kind that doesn't give up." Minutes bled into hours. Hannah and her team worked with surgical focus, cutting away blood-matted hair, probing with forceps. Raven groaned once, a deep haunting sound before sedation finally claimed him. When Hannah stepped back, peeling off her gloves, her face was grave. The bullet tore through the shoulder, nicked a major artery, damaged muscle. "If I don't operate, he'll die within the night." "Then operate," Daniel said instantly. Hannah met his eyes with equal firmness. "It's not that simple. Surgery like this is delicate, risky, and expensive." "How?" "Expensive?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hannah hesitated. "Supplies, equipment, round-the-clock care, at least 15,000. And even then," she drew in a breath, "his chances are, maybe 40%, not more." The words hit the room like another shot. Clara's hand went to her mouth. Daniel leaned back against the stall door, his chest tightening. He had carried men with worse wounds, dragged them through fire, only to lose them anyway. Now this creature who had carried his own broken soul for 3 years might slip away because of money and odds. Clara whispered, "He saved me. He saved us. We can't lose him." Daniel had no answer. He pressed his hand against his eyes as though he could block the sight of Raven's heaving ribs. Elias had said nothing through it all. He sat on a stool near the corner, hands clasped, his gaze locked on the stallion's great body. His face was carved with something beyond grief, something that looked dangerously close to surrender. Then slowly he stood. He reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket and drew out a thick envelope. Its corners were frayed, the paper softened by years of being carried, but never opened. He held it in both hands, staring at it as though it might burn him. Finally, he stepped forward and laid it on the table before Hannah. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. "My granddaughter didn't get saved," he said. "She died because men like Maddox put money before lives. And I've carried this damn envelope ever since. Settlement money, blood money, never touched it. Couldn't. Felt like betrayal every time I thought about it." He looked at Raven, the black giant stretched helpless in straw, his breath shallow. "But today, this horse saved you." Elias continued his gaze, flicking between Clara and Daniel. "Saved me too, in a way. He stood where I couldn't, and I'll be damned if I let history repeat itself." His hand pressed firmly against the envelope. 15,000. More than enough. Do it. Save. Clara's eyes brimmed, tears streaking down her cheeks. Elias. Daniel tried to speak, but words tangled in his throat. He swallowed hard, the weight of memory crushing him. Dead. Comrades' broken promises, too many graves. He had thought he was beyond tears, but now his chest ached with the effort not to weep. Hannah studied the old man, the envelope, the horse. Slowly, she nodded. "Then we'll begin." The barn transformed into an operating theater. Bright lamps cast harsh yellow light over Raven's dark form. Stainless steel tools clinked-kegged. Assistants moved with focused urgency. Hannah donned fresh gloves, her jaw set like iron. Daniel stood just outside the stall, fists clenched around the hilt of his combat knife. The last relic of another war. Clara knelt a few feet away, lips moving silently in prayer or plea. Elias stood tall, arms crossed his face, locked against the tide of memories. Through the glass of the stall window, they watched Hannah's hands move swift and precise. Forceps dipped, clamps tight, sutures pulled. The sound of Raven's breathing filled the room, ragged but steady like a drumbeat refusing to cease. "If he doesn't make it," Clara's voice cracked. She reached for Daniel's hand without realizing. "If he doesn't." Daniel squeezed her fingers once hard. "He will. He has to." Elias's voice came rough but steady as stone. "He'll live because he has to. Because Laya would want it that way." The words hung in the air, fragile and defiant, as the battle for Raven's life raged under the lights. The barn was lit like a lighthouse in the storm of night. Yellow surgical lamps blazed inside the converted stall, where Dr. Hannah Lowe worked over Raven's massive body. Every So often, a sharp clink of metal carried through the wooden walls, followed by the low guttural sound of the stallion fighting sedation. Outside, the night pressed close, forest whispering in the wind. Daniel sat on the porch steps of the barn, elbows braced on his knees, eyes locked on the ground, but ears tuned to every sound. Clara leaned against one of the porch posts, exhaustion dragging her. Eyelids lower and lower, until finally sleep stole her, her head nodding sideways, lips parting in a restless sigh. Elias stood farther back near the tree where the glow of the barn couldn't quite reach. He stared at the night like a man expecting ghosts to walk out of it. Hours stretched, each minute punctuated by the scraping of instruments, the occasional muttered instruction from Hannah or Raven's muffled groan. The air carried the sharp bite of antiseptic mixed with the copper tang of blood. Daniel's chest was tight. He had been in this place before, outside operating rooms, listening to comrades fighting for their lives while surgeons tried to stitch them back together, and every time the helplessness gnawed at him worse than bullets ever could. But the soldier in him refused to sit idle. Sometime after midnight, Clara stirred in her sleep. Her pack slid from her lap, thumping softly against the porch. Papers spilled out across the wooden planks, rustling in the night breeze. Daniel bent down, gathering them quietly so as not to wake her. But when his eyes caught on the top sheet, he froze. It was a transportation permit official, state document stamped with the seal of Montana, authorizing the movement of lumber from Lone Creek to a shipping hub, out of state. The problem was obvious to anyone who had handled paperwork. The seal was blurred, the watermark wrong, a forgery. In the signature, Daniel narrowed his eyes. He had seen it once before in a framed newspaper clipping at the diner. Governor Reed Albright. Son of a bitch, Daniel muttered under his breath. He flipped through the other papers, photographs grainy but clear enough to recognize faces. One showed Cole Maddox shaking hands with a man in a government-issued blazer, a fat envelope, changing hands between them. Another showed trucks lined up under cover of night, their plates concealed, their loads stacked with timber that looked far too fresh to have been legally felled. Daniel's pulse quickened. This wasn't a rogue logging boss, bribing a few locals. This was systemic. He sat back, papers trembling slightly, in his grip. This goes higher than Maddox, he whispered. This is the go-damn governor. You're right, Daniel jerked his head up. Elias had stepped into the lantern glow, his expression grim. The old man reached into his jacket and pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth. He unrolled it carefully to reveal a battered handheld recorder scratched from years of use. His fingers caressed, pictured it with the tenderness of a relic. I've kept this for 2 years, Elias said, quietly. Didn't know if it'd ever matter. But now, he pressed play. Static hiss, then voices filled the night. The first was unmistakable Cole Maddox's. Low draw, deliberate, carrying the clipped cadence of a man who had once given orders on a battlefield. Collapse was messy, but manageable. We'll frame it as ground instability. The papers will eat that up. Then another voice, smoother, heavier with authority, the kind of tone Daniel had heard from generals briefing politicians. Elias's jaw tightened. That voice, he said. You hear it? Daniel's guts sank. He already knew. Reed Albright. On the recording, the governor's voice continued. Clean it up. Get rid of the chatter. Blame it on hunters if you have to. God knows they're careless enough. But this doesn't reach Helena. Do you understand me? Maddox's chuckle followed crystal clear. The recorder clicked off. The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. Elias's fists clenched until the knuckles widened. My Laya died in that collapse. They called it an accident, a freak slide, but it was their hands that pushed the rocks, their lies that buried her. Daniel's jaw AHD from how hard he was grinding his teeth. He looked at Clara. She had stirred, awake during the recording, her face pale, eyes wide as the words sank in. They killed a child, Elias said, voice trembling, and they laughed about it. The three of them sat in silence for a long while, the rain beginning to patter lightly on the barn roof, mixing with the steady hum of the surgical lamp inside. Daniel spread the papers on the porch, laying the forged permits beside the photographs beside Elias's recorder. Slowly, the fragments assembled into a picture none of them wanted to see. Illegal logging, Clara said softly. That's just the surface. Daniel nodded. It's cover. They're stripping timber to make way for something bigger. Supply chains, access, routes. Once the forest's gone, no one questions trucks running day and night, Elias added. And those trucks aren't carrying just wood. They're hauling minerals, rare earth copper, maybe uranium. The mountains are rich, and they're bleeding them dry. Money laundering through timber sales, Daniel continued. Profits funneled into shell companies. Maddox handles the dirty work sabotage. Intimidation accidents staged to look natural. Albright signs the papers keeps. The press quiet. Smooths it all over with state contracts. Clara's hands tightened into fists. It's not just corruption. It's organized like a military campaign. Maddox is the commander on the ground. Albright is the political cover. Together, they're untouchable. Daniel's voice was flat, but it carried the weight of certainty. It's a war. Only difference is the battlefield's a forest. The weapons are saws and explosives, and the casualties are anyone who stands in their way. Clara closed her eyes, inhaling shakily. If we go public now with what little we have, they'll crush us, smear us, jail us. Maybe worse. We need more. Something undeniable. Elias's stare was hard as granite. Undeniable costs blood. That's what I've learned. Number? Daniel's reply was sharp. Undeniable costs courage. And if Raven pulls through, he's proof that courage still matters. Inside the barn, the voice rose urgent, clamped now. Hold him steady. The sound of metal echoed, followed by Raven's groan that shook them to the marrow. All three turned their heads toward the round of their stall, but none moved. Moving would change nothing. They were locked outside, with nothing but their resolve. The rain picked up, drumming harder on the roof, running down the porch steps. In rivulets. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, though the night wasn't cold. Finally, Elias broke the silence. His words came slow, but with the weight of a verdict. Maddox is a blade, sharp, ruthless, but blades don't wield themselves. The hand on that hilt belongs to Albright, and if he's involved, there are others, higher, richer, more hidden. Daniel leaned back against the porch post, eyes narrowing into the night. Then we stopped thinking small. This isn't about saving one ranger station or even this valley. It's about exposing a system. Maddox is the dog on the leash. Albright is the man holding it. And if there are bigger hands behind him, he let the thought trail, but the implication settled heavy. Clara swallowed her voice, quiet but steady. Then, this isn't just our fight. It's bigger than Raven, bigger than Lone Creek. We're standing against an entire machine. Daniel looked at them both, then at the barn, where Raven's life balanced on a knife's edge. His chest rose, felt the soldier inside him, setting aside despair for purpose. Then we fight, he said simply. Not just for him, for all of it. The rain had been falling since dusk, a steady curtain that blurred the outlines of the Lone Creek Valley. Mud sucked at boots, trees wept under the weight of water, and the world seemed narrowed to a palette of black, gray, and silver. On the porch of Hannah Lowe's clinic, three figures sat in silence. Raven lay inside the barn, recovering from his surgery, each breath of the stallion still a fragile miracle. But there was no more time to wait. Evidence in hand, a trail of bodies. Behind them, and enemies closing in. The choice was clear. Either bury the truth in more silence or drag it into the light. Clara broke the silence first. Her eyes glistened in the lamplight, but her voice carried steel. If we file an official report, it'll die in a drawer before morning, the same way every other report has. Daniel leaned back, rain dripping off the brim of his hood. So, what's your alternative? She met his gaze. We live stream right in their nest. If the people see it before they can silence us, they can't bury it. Elias grunted, rubbing his callous hands together. You realize what you're saying. Once it's live, there's no turning back. No. Safe house. No second chance. Clara nodded, lips pressed tight. Exactly. The old man studied her for a long moment. Then he gave a bitter chuckle. Well, one thing I've learned, truth hidden in files can be burned. Truth, carried by people, can be buried. But truth shouted to a crowd. That's the one thing they can't put back in the box. He glanced toward the barn where Raven rested. Let's finish this. Daniel checked his pistol, slid his combat knife into the sheath on his belt. Fine, he said. Then tonight, we make them choose justice or exposure. Outside, thunder rolled like artillery. They reached the logging camp near midnight. It sat in a wide clearing, a skeletal sprawl of machinery and stacked lumber. By day, it might have looked abandoned, another casualty of the town's collapse. But tonight, floodlights blazed, diesel engines roared, and trucks idled like beasts of burden waiting for their load. Clara crouched low behind a fallen trunk, raised her phone, and touched the screen. A red dot glowed. The feed went live. Daniel's instinct screamed a split second before the lights shifted. Beams of white swept across the clearing, pinning them in the glare. A deep, familiar voice rang out. Cain Cole Maddox strode from the heart, made of the camp rain plastering his hair to his forehead, a waterproof coat gleaming under the lamps. He carried a rifle casually, like an extension of his arm. Behind him, a dozen men fanned out, mercenaries, not loggers. Their formation was tight, overlapping arcs of fire, the kind Daniel had seen countless times in Afghanistan. Cole stopped a few paces from the nearest pile of timber. "It ends tonight," he shouted, voice carrying over the storm. "No more witnesses, no more accidents that need explaining." The mercenaries tightened the ring. Rain hissed against their barrels. Daniel's pulse slowed the way it always did when death stood close. He measured the terrain, the distance, the odds. They weren't good, but Clara had already angled her phone, broadcasting every second. The world now saw what they faced. Not a simple dispute over logging, but an armed paramilitary force led by a former soldier turned profiteer. Daniel's jaw set. "You won't get your clean finish, Maddox." Cole smirked. "I already have." And then the ground shook. From the black edge of the forest came a sound older than words. A stallion scream, primal and thunderous. Heads snapped toward the noise, just as the fence at the clearing's edge exploded into splinters. Raven burst through. The massive horse was still bandaged, his shoulder raw from the bullet wound, but the fire and found fire in pro. His amber eyes burned brighter than pain. Rain slicked his coat until he gleamed, like living obsidian. He reared high hooves, slamming down with the force of a hammer, scattering the mercenaries nearest the fence. "Jesus Christ!" One of them gasped, stumbling back. Another raised his weapon, but Raven surged forward, a black avalanche. He crashed into a man, sending him spinning into the mud. Another went flying under a sweep of hooves. Chaos rippled through the ring as the impossible reality of a war charging through gunfire broke their discipline. Clara didn't hesitate. She dashed forward, seized the dangling reins. Raven bent instinctively, muscles coiling, and in one motion, she swung onto his back. The live stream caught it all as a wounded Rares' truck still smoldering in the background, mercenaries scattering, and a colossal black horse erupting from the storm with a woman on his back. Comments exploded across the feed. "Holy hell, is this real? That's the Maddoxes." The crew armed to the teeth. "The horse. Look at the horse." Raven galloped through the ring, scattering men, leaving arcs of mud and spray. Clara clung tight, guiding him through fire and floodlights, the camera jolting with every stride. By the time he wheeled back toward Daniel and Elias, the siege was broken. Cole Maddox stood his ground. Daniel stepped forward into the open rain, coursing down his face. His pistol was in his hand, but when Cole tossed aside his rifle and drew a combat knife, Daniel felt his pulse shift. "You want it clean?" Cole shouted. "We'll do it clean like soldiers. No cameras, no excuses." Daniel holstered the pistol, drew his own blade. They closed the distance. Boots, splashing in the ankle-deep water that had pulled across the yard. Then steel met steel. The first clash rattled through Daniel's bones. Cole was strong, trained, ruthless. Each swing came with military precision. Every thrust meant to kill. But Daniel had lived through deserts where every shadow held a trigger, through nights where one mistake meant a coffin. He absorbed the blows, countered with precision. Memories of comrades lost in Afghanistan sharpened every strike. "You think you're a soldier?" Daniel growled, slamming his forearm against Cole's. "You're a butcher." Cole's knife sliced, shallow across Daniel's arm. "War makes us all butchers," he snarled. "At least I profited from it." The rain turned the yard into a pit of mud and blood. Clara, still streaming, circled on Raven, the lens capturing every brutal exchange. The viewer count ticked upward, thousands, then tens of thousands. Cole drove Daniel back against a timber, stack blade slashing for his throat. Daniel twisted, shoved, answered with a savage headbutt that cracked bone against bone. Cole reeled, but only for a heartbeat. "You can't win," Cole spat, charging again. Daniel's knife flicked, parried, then caught Cole's wrist. In a single motion, he twisted, slammed the man face first, into the mud, and drove his knee between Cole's shoulder blades. The blade hovered at Cole's throat. "You're finished," Daniel said. His voice was steady, but his hand trembled with restraint. "Not because I kill you, but because the whole damn state is watching." Cole froze slowly, his eyes lifted toward Clara's camera. For the first time that night, fear broke through the mask. The live stream surged. Comments cascaded faster than the screen could display. That's him. Cole Maddox, the logging boss. Armed mercenaries, look at their rifles. My God, the horse again. Someone clipped this. Local reporters tuned in, streaming it to their stations. News anchors broke into broadcasts. Within minutes, the fight in the rain became a viral spectacle, and the image of Raven charging through fire with Clara on his back, replayed again and again, looping across phones and laptops. The shot of Daniel holding Cole's face, down in the mud knife, pressed to his throat, became the defining frame. There was no way back. Daniel bound Cole's wrists with rough ropes scavenged from the camp. Mud stray his face, blood mixing with rain. Clara steadied the camera, making sure. The image was clear. Elias stepped into frame, eyes hollow but blazing. He faced the lens squarely. My granddaughter Laya Ward died 2 years ago. They called it an accident, but it was murder. Tonight you've seen the truth. The man responsible stands here in chains. This is where justice begins. Cole thrashed against the rope. You fools, he shouted, voice ragged. You don't understand. I was just the blade. Albright was the hand, the governor ordered it. The words hung in the night, carried by the livream into thousands of homes. Viewers flooded the feed. He just named the governor. It goes to the top. Read. Albright, investigate him. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Police cars, drawn by the uproar they could no longer ignore, sped toward the camp. Daniel tightened the knots then, rose staring down at his beaten adversary. Game's over, Maddox. And for the first time, Cole Maddox had no retort. The storm that had drowned the logging yard passed in the night, but its echo rolled through the state for days. By morning, the live stream had been clipped, captioned, and shared across every platform that could carry a video. News vans carved ruts into the logging road. Helicopters slapped the air above the clearing. Reporters shouted questions toward yellow tape and blinking patrol lights. The image that led every broadcast was the same. A colossal black horse, shouldering through floodlights and gun smoke while a ranger clung to his back. A veteran pinning a paramilitary, toss into the mud, a confession flung at a phone held high. Cole Maddox didn't leave the camp as a commander. He left in cuffs, his face gray, under stripes of dried rain and blood. Officers read him his rights in the headlight glare, while Clara steadied the camera for one last tight frame. Daniel watched them load Cole into the cruiser, jaw clenched, every muscle, braced for a last-minute twist. None came. The car doors shut. The convoy rolled away. By noon, the governor's office had released a statement categorically, denying any involvement and promising to assist fully. By evening, the wording shifted to deep concern and administrative leave. Within 48 hours, the State House steps were a wall of microphones. Reed Albright read from a page with both hands, the words slipping as he tried to control the tremor in his voice. He spoke of personal accountability and distractions from governance. Then he said the word that mattered most: resign. Federal agents followed the cameras into town. Subpoenas multiplied. Warrants went out. A line of unmarked sedans appeared at Lone Creek Timber's headquarters, and the padlocks went on. The same sheriff who had nodded politely over Elias's envelopes for 2 years stood in the glow of the nightly news, promising cooperation and reforms, and something that sounded like repentance. Behind the spectacle, there were interviews, long, careful, draining interviews. Daniel, Clara, and Elias sat under fluorescent lights in windowless rooms, telling and retelling the story until the edges went raw. Every statement was transcribed, every timeline cross-checked. Agents asked about chains of custody, about who held which crate on which day, about the small sound between 2 words on a recording that proved a meeting happened where the governor said it did not. They asked how. A horse had appeared like a battering ram inside a ranger office. Daniel's answer never changed. He knew. Protection followed the questioning, quiet but firm. Unmarked cars idled near the clinic. A deputy dozed in a folding chair outside Hannah's barn. Phones that had rung with threats went silent, then rang again with offers, with thanks, with prayers from strangers, who had watched the feed on kitchen tables and in roadside diners and in hospital rooms where night shifts stretched long. The state did not change overnight, but something cracked, and once a crack runs straight through the center of a lie, it spreads. Raven healed in inches. At first he lay still beneath lights that never fully cooled breath, rising and falling beneath bandages, Hannah changed with hands that never faltered. The stallion's shoulder was a map of sutures and shaved fur. The harsh geometry of medicine stitched into the powerful sweep of an animal made for motion. Antibiotics, fluids, gentle sedation, long hours of watching for small signs. A twitch in ear flicked the shift of a rib cage that meant the pain crested and ebbed. Hannah's voice was steady whenever she came to the door to report. Stable, holding, responded. When she finally said he's coming back, Clara's knees gave and she sat down hard on the barn aisle, laughing and crying in the same breath. The video of his charge had gone everywhere. Children sent crayon drawings, a black triangle horse with amber circles for eyes, a stick figure ranger on his back, rain as blue lines slanting across the page. Letters came from rescue stables and police K9 units and firefighters, who knew what it meant to run toward a burning thing. A conservation group in Colorado shipped a pallet of feed. A woman from Maine mailed a hand-stitched blanket with a loyal horse on one corner and the words "Black Horse of Lone Creek" on the other. Reporters knocked with sugary smiles and microphones held like flowers. Hannah turned most of them away. "He's not a prop," she said. "He's a patient." When she let a camera crew in, it was for 15 seconds from the far end of the aisle. The shot was simple. A dark flank rising and falling, a bandage clean and white against black. A hand reaching lightly to stroke a broad forehead. No commentary, no voiceover. It spread all the same. For all the talk, Daniel measured progress by what he could feel beneath his palm. He came each morning, at first light, standing in the quiet, while the dogs in the outer kennels settled from their breakfast chorus, and the barn warmed from the night. He watched for a flicker of recognition, and when he spoke, for the way Raven's ear ticked toward his voice before an eye opened. "Hey, soldier," he'd murmur, and sometimes Raven's nostrils fluttered in that almost laugh that had kept Daniel sane through winters. When Hannah finally nodded him in without a mask and said, "Careful," he stepped into the stall as though entering a church. The day Raven stood by himself, the world narrowed to the stall. He rolled his weight forward, testing, bracing. Muscles worked under satin, black hide. The great column of the neck bowed the shoulder, held tight against the pull of new scars. Clara held her, breath so long that Hannah touched her sleeve and mouthed, "Breathe." Raven gathered himself and rose. When he found his feet, he stood there, breathing hard, head low, asking nothing but a moment. Daniel laid his hand against the warm slope of the neck and felt a tremor that was not fear. It was the body remembering that it was strong. Raven lifted his head. The stall windows poured in late afternoon light, the kind that makes dust mows look like gold leaf. He answered that light with a long, proud call that rolled through rafters and down the lane to the road. Hannah laughed out loud. Elias pressed his fist to his mouth. Clara wiped her face and said, "There, you are." As if a lost thing had walked out of the trees. Hero became a word that day. It made Daniel uneasy when strangers said it about him, his hand rising reflexively as if to bat it aside. When they said it about Raven, Daniel didn't argue. You didn't argue with the truth. The foundation began on a piece of scrap paper in Hannah's office. They needed a bank account for donations that had started to pile up in envelopes and online. "We need a name," Hannah said, flipping, her pen in her fingers, something honest. Elias had been quiet all morning. He reached for the pen, wrote in slow block letters, and slid the paper back. Laya Foundation. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The room held both the weight of the name, something that eased under it, not forgiveness, not yet, but direction. The charter took shape over a week at Hannah's kitchen table. Mission: protect the forested watershed of Lone Creek and adjacent lands. Document and deter illegal extraction. Provide grants to families harmed by environmental violations. Fund training for rangers and volunteers. In field evidence collection. Support equine and canine rescue units used in wilderness enforcement. Clara hammered the language into something grant committees would recognize without sanding off the parts that mattered. She knew which phrases got calls returned and which made bureaucrats hide behind policy. Daniel's job was easier to describe and harder to do. Security and investigations, Clara wrote under his name. It summed up trail cameras and night watches, chain of custody logbooks, and safe routes home. A network of veterans who didn't mind crossing a county line at 3 a.m. because someone heard a chainsaw where a chainsaw shouldn't be. He rebuilt his kit from nothing. Maps laminated and marked a battered field. Radio refitted a small drone. A list of phone numbers that began with Hannah and Clara and Elias, and grew to include a deputy, a reporter, a judge who had known the law too long to be bought cheap. Elias refused the title of chairman. "I'll be what I am," he said, "the one who knocks on doors." He knew which porches had a shotgun behind them and which had a pie cooling, which pastors would let him speak before the hymn, which 8th grade teacher would turn a school assembly into a lesson on watersheds. Without asking permission, he showed up at kitchen tables and garage gatherings and explained how a tree holds a hill together, how a hill holds a creek in place, how a creek keeps a valley alive. He did not talk about Laya unless someone asked. And when they did, he told the truth without making it a weapon. The account filled faster than they expected. Small checks in shaky handwriting. A ass wire from a conservation organization in Oregon. An envelope of cash slipped under Hannah's door with a note for the horse, for the forest. No name. When Clara launched the official page with a 2-minute cut of the live stream and a plain statement of work to come, she added a photo of Raven pressing his forehead to Elias's chest. "We want more of this," she wrote. "Not the crying, the choosing." They set up an office in the old feed store. Hannah's nephew painted a sign. Volunteers hauled in desks and file cabinets. A retired accountant named Doris showed up with brownies and a ledger and did not leave until she had labeled everything that could be labeled. On opening day, a line curved down the block. People signed their names on a clipboard and underlined them twice. Trust does not grow in a headline. It grows in the long ordinary. The days after, Daniel and Clara learned each other's edges by the way they worked. She was methodical, where he was instinctive, fearless, where he was cautious, aware of how a camera could be a shield and a sword in ways he had never imagined. He showed her the difference between a careless boot print and one that meant someone would come back, how to move half a step to the left so a flashlight beam didn't make her a target, how to sleep in 2-hour shifts and still function. She showed him how to read power without a uniform, who answered calls out of duty, and who out of fear which offices had new locks and why. They did not say much at first about anything that mattered. They didn't need to. The work braided them together. The quieter things came later. A hand on a shoulder that stayed a second too long. A laugh that unclenched a room. A night on the clinic porch when Clara said, simply, "You didn't let go." And Daniel answered, "Neither did you." When the nipper ran a photo of them at a school assembly. Clara holding a poster about watershed health, while Daniel stood in the back with Raven wearing a padded lead rope. There were comments. Most were kind, a few were not. They learned to let the unkind ones go. People will always write stories about what they don't know, Clara said. We just write ours better. Daniel, who had built walls inside himself high enough to keep out the good with the bad, found a gap and left it. Elias changed in ways only the people closest could measure. The first change was in his house. He put Laya's photograph back on the mantle, not as a marker of pain, but as a promise kept. He washed his good shirt without being asked and wore it to the Foundation's first town meeting. He laughed at a child's joke in the grocery store aisle and didn't apologize for the sound. At the cemetery, he said what he had to say with his palms open instead of clenched. "We're doing it," he told the stone. "Not for revenge, for repair." Hannah watched them all with a satisfaction she rarely allowed herself to name. She'd given a horse back to a man, but the horse had given something back to all of them, a reason to be the person they had been trying to remember. The patrol began before sunrise. The valley was a bowl of low cloud, and dew every blade of grass tipped with light. Breath plumaged from Raven's nostrils, like smoke in the cold. He stood tall and whole, the line of his shoulder, still marked by a pale seam that would fade but never vanish. It did not need to. Daniel tightened the cinch and checked it twice. Clara pulled on gloves, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Elias swung into the saddle with the awkward grace of a man whose muscles remembered more than they admitted. They said little. The quiet wasn't avoidance anymore, it was comfort. They rode out along the ridge. The light came in layers. First, the faint brass of false dawn. Then a clean spill of gold that cut through fir boughs and found the creek below. Hoof beatats thudded softly on damp earth. The forest made its small mourning sounds. A jay scolding a chipmunk, declaring ownership of a log that had belonged to 1,000 chipmunks before. From the high point, you could see the scar where the logging camp had burned away. Equipment hauled out ground, scraped down to pack dirt. Grass would take it back. Trees would, too, in time. The bridge at Bear Creek was gone, the river running clean and open while surveyors mapped a new crossing with numbers that meant safety instead of shortcuts. Somewhere beyond the next mountain, courtrooms were calling roll and reading charges and scheduling trials that would cool time, grind slowly but not stop. Clara turned in the saddle to look at Daniel. He was already looking back. Neither needed to say what sat between them. We made it this far, we go farther. Elias tipped his hat in a gesture that used to belong to another life and fit this one fine. If she were here, he said, she'd tell us to stop talking and ride before the sun gets ideas. Then we'd better keep ahead of it, Daniel said. Raven lifted into a caner, the kind that feels like flying without leaving the ground. The trail unspooled, the creek kept pace, the trees opened and closed, like gates. They didn't push him, they didn't need to. It was enough to move, together. On a meadow edge, bright with early airs, Raven slowed and turned his head toward the forest, as if acknowledging a presence only he could sense. He raised his neck and gave a high ringing call that the hills threw back in gentler echoes. It wasn't the battle scream from the night of the camp, it was something broader. A statement, not a challenge. In that sound was the inventory of what had been lost and what had been kept. Names that would not be forgotten, a valley that would not be surrendered. A promise that rang louder than any whispered threat. People would tell this story in 100 ways, some trimming it to minutes, others spinning it into sagas. But this was the version carved where beginnings meet endings. 3 riders and a black horse moving across a morning that felt new because it was. No speeches, only nods. No guarantees, only the choice to ride forward. They reached the boundary marker, a weathered post with a fresh plate stamped simply, Lia's Line. Each touched it in turn, a vow unspoken, then turned along the border, taking the first patrol of many to come. Behind them, the sun rose and spilled fire across Raven's dark hide, until the scar along his shoulders seemed to blaze like a brand of defiance. He tossed his head and broke into a steady run, hooves drumming a rhythm the valley seemed to echo back. Clara's soft laugh cut through the crisp air. Elias straightened in his saddle, the tension leaving his shoulders. Daniel fixed his gaze down the trail, not on escape, but on a way through. Somewhere in town, a child's crayon would sketch a black horse. Somewhere in the capital, a prosecutor would open a binder, and the first page of justice would be written. Somewhere in a quiet barn, Hannah would close a stall door, grateful for silence that finally felt safe. The world wasn't fixed, maybe it never would be, but it had tilted just enough to let the light in. Raven's hooves carried that truth. The forest answered it, the creek carried it, and the valley scarred, stubborn, unbroken kept it. Then, from the ridge, a shot cracked through the morning air. The riders froze. Raven's ears snapped forward, his muscles taut as stone. Shadows moved at the tree line, faint but deliberate. Daniel's hand tightened on the reins, his voice low but steady. They think it's finished. It isn't. The valley held its breath. The fight, it seemed, was not over. It was only beginning again.